Before starting this episode of E.A.R, I would like you to first take some safety precautions. Make sure you know at all times where all exits are, and make sure all corners of the room are within your sight. If possible, destroy the corners of your room, so nothing that can get in after you. This is E.A.R, my name is Mr. Dagon, and let us begin. Today we're still talking about Lovecraft. See, I want to keep these episodes short, but I barely scratched the surface. I spent so much time talking about the man, I didn't talk too much about his myths. I didn't even get a chance to mention the Necronomicon. That is big. I am shocked I was not roasted on a fire for that. Now then, the Necronomicon is a book written by the Mad Arab. His name is Abdul Al-Hazard. If you can't tell, I'm terrible at pronunciation, so I am sorry to anyone who is upset by that. Now, Abdul went missing for about 10 years. Nobody knows why. He didn't tell anyone where he went, and sometime after he came back, he wrote the Necronomicon, which got translated into many different languages. This book has kind of served as a monster manual within Lovecraft stories. Pretty much, somehow, Abdul knew about almost every single god, monster, and spell that any of the characters encounter. Somehow, on his 10-year journey, he got all of that information. Almost all of Lovecraft's stories have some mention of the Necronomicon, because the crazy stuff they end up seeing, that the characters end up seeing, is in the Necronomicon already. It includes such fun things as an instruction on how to destroy an egg of Yig using a combination of musical notes. Yig being a very big snake monster thing. God, I guess, would be the proper term, but it's kind of hard to call any of these anything. Most godlike beings in Cthulhu mythos are referred to as the Old Ones or Elder Gods. So, God, I guess, is the best thing to call them. However, they're not exactly... See, I hesitate to call them gods because while they are powerful creatures, and again, this being Lovecraft, they are powerful creatures that we cannot even pretend to understand. None of them really have any of the traits we normally give to gods. None of them really create or rule or... Honestly, we can't even pretend to understand them. So maybe it's less that they're not gods and more we can't understand them. We can't actually understand God itself. I'm going to be now I got the Necronomicon. Let's go ahead and touch on a couple of his more famous creatures. I mentioned Cthulhu, the great big man himself. Head of a squid, body of a human, and wings and skin of a dragon. Now, he first appears in the story aptly named The Call of Cthulhu. The Call of Cthulhu is a collection of 3 stories that are all written by the same character. These stories are found as manuscripts. These stories are found in manuscripts after their author dies. The first being telling the tale of a strange statue that was found buried that has his likeness. You know, the weird creature that nobody's seen with squid head and yada yada yada. Second being an encounter with a bunch of cult worshippers at night that the police ended up having to open fire on. And finally, the retelling of a story of a bunch of sailors whose boat went adrift at sea, and they ended up upon the city of R'lyeh. Again, it's very hard to know if I'm pronouncing these correct, Because in Cthulhu mythos, I don't think we're ever supposed to be able to correctly pronounce any of these. They weren't exactly named by us. They were named by those creatures we can't pretend to understand. In it, they accidentally come across this city floating in the sea, go on to explore, and wake up Cthulhu. Only one ends up getting out alive, with Cthulhu either causing the others to go insane with his mere presence or other horrible things happening to them. As Cthulhu goes into the sea after the last man fleeing on his boat, he turns the boat around and smashes it right into our little god's head. It cracks open, and Cthulhu seems to have been defeated. And then as he is fleeing, he looks back to see Cthulhu's body putting itself together again. Cthulhu can't exactly die. There are some eldritch things that can. Cthulhu is not on that list. It is later found out that the sailor died soon after telling his story, presumably murdered, and there's suspicion that the original author of these manuscripts was murdered as well. Now, since we're covering, the creatures and the myths, I would have to tell the one that my name actually comes from. Mine comes from a creature named Dagon, which, again, I talked a little in the shadow over Innsmouth. He's the god who had the fish people making deal with the townspeople of Innsmouth and was planning on taking over the world. Now, what does Dagon look like? Well, he's got a couple different appearances. But that tends to happen when the original source is a book. See, the original text only described him as Polyphemus-like. Polyphemus being the giant god of Poseidon. Or giant son of Poseidon. Sorry. Either way, that is not exactly the most detailed of descriptions, considering most of the gods weren't really detailed. Still, he probably has 3 eyes. That was a feature of Poseidon's son. The most common one I've seen is there was also a Call of Cthulhu video game. Ironically, the video game deals with Dagon and Innsmouth. It actually follows the story of Shadow over Innsmouth, with you fighting Dagon at the end. The appearance they do for Dagon is pretty interesting. A very large, fat fish monster with very long, thin arms, a giant gaping maw, almost like a bass, and tentacles instead of a back fin. Very creepy. I will give the game credit. I ripped on it a lot, but it did have very nice monster designs. Now, for one I did not talk about at all. The Mountains of Madness. Or At the Mountains of Madness. This is one of his more famous ones, so I'd be in a lot of trouble if I didn't mention it. At the Mountains of Madness, it talks about a group of explorers who go to Antarctica to see what can be seen, essentially. They find beneath the ice at a mountain range a large city, the city being one that used to belong to the Old Ones. Not their worshippers, they used to live there themselves. They left behind many carvings and strange alien beings, but the biggest danger they left behind was the Shoggoths. Shoggoths were created by the Old Ones to be slaves. They can change shape to perform any task and reflect any thought. As they explore a bit more, they also find out that the Shoggoths killed all the old ones that were there, and those that weren't killed fled. The Shoggoths now rule the city and have started their own little farm with these blind 6-foot-tall penguins, which, for all the horror it builds up, the idea of giant penguins is always silly. I could not help but chuckle at that. The story ends with a few survivors eventually escaping by plane, and the one narrating the story taking a look back to see that there was something else beyond the mountains, something so terrifying he refuses to say what it is. Okay, one last story to talk about, and then I'll let you off the hook. Now, this is actually his most successful story, which is very funny because it's not very well known. I think it's because it didn't include any Cthulhu mythos or Lovecraftian horror monsters or anything like that. It's just a very well-written horror story, and that is the Dunwich Horror. The Dunwich Horror takes place in a small fictional town of Dunwich. Excuse me again. Now, in this small town of Dunwich, there's a farmer, Wilbur Wheatley. And he has a son who is a deformed monstrosity. Now, he keeps his son locked up in the barn because he doesn't want anyone seeing it. It's that bad. Many suspicious things happen that trip the town folks, but nothing too big. The biggest is Wilbur tends to have a very strange smell. People start disappearing. Wilbur keeps buying more cattle, but his herd never gets any bigger. It all comes to a head when Wilbur goes to the local university to take a look at their copy of the Necronomicon. On his way home, he's attacked by a dog that is set off by the strange smell Wilbur has stuck to his body. And the professors that go to investigate find that Wilbur's corpse melts. And it wasn't entirely human if the melting did not tip you off. Now, after some time, with Wilbur no longer tending what's in the farmhouse, it suddenly explodes, and the creature within, a completely invisible monster, rampages across Dunwich, leaving giant footprints the size of tree trunks, destroying buildings, knocking down trees. And it just continues to terrorize and murder, and it's just very interesting. It does finally end with the professors finding the bit of the Necronomicon that Wilbur was looking at, figuring out what he was trying to do, trying to open a gate to Yog-Sothoth. These are so fun to try and pronounce. Not very well known god, I think. I think it's supposed to be one of the elder gods. Anyway, and finally destroying the creature, which leaves a huge burned area. Now, that is all the time we have. I'm going to get going. Thank you once again for joining me for the second episode of E.A.R. Next time, I promise, I will talk about something other than Lovecraft, although maybe I'll be visiting this again for a little more details and just to talk a bit more about the stories. Thank you again and have a wonderful evening.